I kept my study locked for 10 years. When my son's wife copied my key, I already knew it. My son called in a panic, crying that she went through the study and the bank froze their accounts. I had been ready for this from the very beginning. My name is Douglas. I am 68 years old, a retired logistics contractor, and I am still healing from the financial wounds my own blood tried to inflict on me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your worth. The microscopic fleck of blue molding clay was practically invisible against the aged brass of the deadbolt. Anyone else would have brushed it away as dust, but in my line of work you learn to see the anomalies. I did not gasp. I did not place a trembling hand against the heavy oak door of the study and mourn my late wife, Joanne. To my son Cameron and his wife Melanie, this room was a sacred shrine of grief, a tomb of memories locked away since the day she passed. In reality, it was the nerve center where I silently managed a highly lucrative private logistics portfolio. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and immediately accessed the hidden security feed. I had installed the micro camera in the hallway, molding 3 months prior, right after I caught Melanie lingering too long near my filing cabinets. The footage from the previous night loaded instantly. The screen showed Melanie kneeling before the study door while I was supposedly fast asleep. Her hands moved with practiced precision, pressing a block of blue clay directly into the keyhole to capture the exact groove and depth of the lock. The conflict ignited in my chest a cold and calculated realization. She had the shape of the key. She was going to breach the sanctuary. I did not rush out to confront them. I locked my phone and began preparing the room for her inevitable entry. The invasion escalated the very next afternoon when Cameron and Melanie arrived for our obligatory Sunday dinner. There were no warm greetings, no questions about my health. Cameron threw his coat over the chair and aggressively launched into a complaint about his mounting apartment rent. He paced the kitchen, demanding that I downsize and sell my 4-bedroom home to help fund their lifestyle. Melanie sat at the island, sneering openly at my faded flannel shirt and pushing away the generic brand coffee I poured for her. Cameron assumed I was broke. He believed I had sold my former logistics business for pennies to pay for Joanne's medical bills a decade ago, a narrative I allowed him to believe to test his character. I remained completely silent, sipping my own coffee, letting their arrogant entitlement fester and echo off the walls. The tension spiked sharply when Melanie leaned over the counter, her eyes drifting toward the hallway. She explicitly suggested they move in and take over the locked study to use as a nursery. She eyed the door with thinly veiled greed, arguing that a man my age had no use for locked rooms and secret memories. Cameron nodded in agreement, completely complicit in his wife's blatant attempt to strip me of my space. I looked at my son, realizing he was no longer the boy I raised, but a willing participant in his own greed. I calmly told them dinner was over and asked them to leave. The second their taillights faded down the driveway, I walked down the hall and unlocked the study. The heavy door clicked shut behind me. I bypassed the dusty photo albums and the old rocking chair. I pulled back the Persian rug and spun the dial on the heavy floor safe hidden beneath the floorboards. I removed my authentic financial portfolio, the ironclad trusts, and the genuine deeds to my assets, securing them in a secondary, undetectable wall vault. In their place, I began constructing a meticulously crafted honeypot. I placed a fabricated leather ledger inside the floor. Safe its pages detailing a massive unsecured offshore account holding $3.5 million. Beside the ledger, I laid a stack of blank, pre-signed property deeds. I had planted these decoy documents 3 years ago when I first noticed Melanie snooping through my incoming mail. I knew Melanie's overwhelming greed would completely blind her to the lack of security protocols on the documents. The trap was armed. The question was no longer if she would strike, but exactly when her arrogance would push her to cross the point of no return. I closed the safe, rolled the rug back into place, and walked out of the room, leaving the bait waiting in the dark. 3 nights later, the motion sensor alert on my phone vibrated violently against my nightstand. The digital clock read 2 in the morning. Melanie had used her newly cut key. I lay perfectly still in the dark, watching the live infrared feed from my bedroom monitor. The heavy oak door of the study opened without a sound. Melanie slipped inside, completely ignoring the sentimental items she had so often claimed to respect in front of Cameron. She headed straight for the center of the room, rolling back the rug with greedy anticipation. She opened the floor safe, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of her cell phone flashlight. I watched as she frantically photographed every page of the decoy offshore ledgers, her fingers trembling with excitement. She reached into the stack of papers, pulling out one of the blank, pre-signed property deeds, and slipped it directly into her jacket pocket. She did not hesitate. She did not show an ounce of guilt. She quietly closed the safe, replaced the rug, and locked the door behind her, vanishing into the silent hallway. The tension escalated to a dangerous new threshold. Melanie now possessed forged ammunition and believed she held the keys to my entire financial existence. The invisible breach was complete, forcing me to accelerate my counter-offensive before she could inflict real damage. The doorbell chimed at 10 in the morning, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the quiet of the house. I did not rush to answer it. I simply watched the live feed from the porch camera on my phone. It was Melanie. She stood on my welcome mat, balancing 2 large, expensive paper grocery bags from that high-end organic market downtown, a place she normally claimed was too far out of her way to visit. Her posture was completely different today. The arrogant slouch and the impatient tapping of her designer shoes were gone. Instead, she stood perfectly upright, wearing a soft pastel sweater and a rehearsed expression of gentle concern. I opened the door, and her face immediately stretched into a sickeningly sweet smile. She practically lunged forward to kiss my cheek, a gesture so foreign and forced that I barely suppressed a flinch. "Good morning, Douglas," she sang out, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I brought you some fresh groceries. I figured you might not have had the energy to get out to the store this week." I stepped aside, letting her sweep into the hallway. I did not mention that I had been to the market just yesterday, nor did I point out that she had never once bought groceries for me in the 5 years she had been married to my son. I simply thanked her and followed her into the kitchen. She began emptying the bags onto the granite island, displaying imported cheeses, organic berries, and artisan bread. It was a performance, a calculated display of the devoted daughter-in-law stepping in to care for the frail, struggling elder. "Are you sleeping all right, Douglas?" she asked, not looking at me as she placed a carton of almond milk in the refrigerator. "You looked a little tired on Sunday. I just want to make sure you are not pushing yourself too hard." I watched her hands moving with frantic, practiced energy. She was setting a stage. I decided to give her exactly the audience she wanted. "I am doing fine, Melanie," I replied, keeping my tone deliberately slow, letting a slight tremor enter my voice. "Just a bit slower these days, you know how it is." She turned around, her eyes wide with exaggerated pity. "I do know," she murmured, taking a step closer. "Cameron and I worry about you so much. Living in this big house all by yourself. It is a lot to manage. Sometimes people your age start to feel overwhelmed. Have you been feeling confused lately? Maybe forgetting things?" The sheer audacity of the question hung in the air. She was not asking out of compassion. She was fishing for an admission, laying the foundational bricks for a narrative of mental decline. The missing offshore ledger from the decoy safe was the motive, and a declaration of incompetence was clearly her chosen weapon. "I have my moments," I said, staring at the floor, playing the part of a defeated old man who does not forget a name or a date now and then. Melanie stepped forward and gently patted my arm. Her touch was ice cold. "Of course," she cooed. "But we need to be careful. In fact, I noticed something strange when I came in." "Where are your car keys, Douglas?" I turned toward the small wooden bowl near the entryway. For 40 years, I had dropped my keys into that exact bowl the moment I walked through the door. I looked inside. The bowl was completely empty. I felt a sudden sharp spike of genuine adrenaline, but I instantly smothered it. I knew exactly where I had put them last night. Melanie had been standing near the entryway while I unlocked the front door for her just 5 minutes ago. She had palmed them. "They should be right there," I muttered, patting my empty pockets with feigned panic. "I always leave them in the bowl." Melanie let out a dramatic, sorrowful sigh. "Oh, Douglas, let us look for them together. You probably just set them down somewhere and forgot. It happens to the best of us." She began a theatrical search of the kitchen opening drawers I never used and looking under mail I had already sorted. I stood in the center of the room, rubbing my temples, playing the role of the bewildered senior citizen perfectly. I watched her out of the corner of my eye as she drifted toward the pantry. She opened the door, reached behind a box of cereal, and let out a triumphant gasp. "Douglas, look," she called out, holding my car keys up by the metal ring. "You put them in the pantry, right next to the oatmeal. How on earth did they get in there?" She walked back to me, her eyes gleaming with a predatory thrill. She was enjoying this. She was relishing the power she thought she was stripping away from me. "You really must be exhausted," she continued, shaking her head. "Putting your keys in the pantry. That is not like you at all. We really need to talk to Cameron about getting you some help. It is not safe for you to be alone if you are getting this confused." The psychological warfare was entirely transparent. She was building a documented history of erratic behavior. She needed me to doubt my own mind so that when she eventually brought a doctor into this house, I would already be completely defeated. I knew I needed to feed her confidence, to make her believe her pathetic trap was working flawlessly so she would become reckless. I let my shoulders slump. I looked at the keys in her hand and then stared blankly at the kitchen appliances. "You might be right, Melanie," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. "I just feel so mixed up today. I went to make toast this morning and I almost put the bread inside the washing machine." I pointed a shaky finger directly at the stainless steel dishwasher. Melanie froze. She stared at the dishwasher, then looked back at me. A slow, greedy smile spread across her face, a smirk of absolute victory that she did not even try to hide. She believed she had won. She believed my mind was actually rotting away right in front of her. "Oh, Douglas," she said softly, slipping her phone out of her pocket, no doubt ready to text my son the moment she stepped outside. "Do not worry about a thing. Cameron and I are going to take care of everything for you. We will make sure you get exactly what you need." She squeezed my shoulder one last time, gathered her purse, and walked out the front door, leaving the expensive groceries sitting on the counter. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut, I dropped the confused posture. I straightened my back, picked up my keys from the counter, and tossed them accurately back into the wooden bowl. I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, terrifying clarity. Melanie was not just a thief. She was actively trying to erase my autonomy. She was building a cage for me, assuming I would just quietly walk inside and lock the door myself. I walked to my own phone, perfectly aware of my surroundings, my memory razor sharp. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to introduce her to the shadow economy she thought she could steal. I picked up the receiver and prepared to call my attorney. I did not waste a single second after the front door clicked shut. I grabbed my keys, walked out to my truck, and drove straight into the heart of the financial district. The city traffic was a chaotic mess, but my mind was a vault of absolute clarity. Melanie thought she was playing a clever game of psychological chess with a deteriorating old man. She did not realize she had just joyfully skipped onto a live minefield. I parked beneath the towering glass structure that housed the most aggressive corporate law firm in the state. I ignored the receptionist and walked directly into the corner office of my attorney, Carter. Carter was a man who operated with surgical precision. He had the instincts of a shark and a mind like a steel trap. He did not offer a polite greeting or ask about my health. He took one look at my face, closed the heavy dossier on his desk, and gave me his full attention. I sat down in the leather chair across from him. "The bait was taken," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. She copied the key, breached the study, and photographed the ledger. She also took one of the blank deeds. Carter leaned back in his chair. He slowly pressed his fingertips together. A cold, calculating smile touched the corners of his mouth. 10 years ago, when my wife Joanne first received her terminal diagnosis, the medical bills began to mount. That was when Carter helped me quietly liquidate the visible assets of my logistics empire. We structured my actual massive wealth into ironclad, impenetrable trusts. We did it precisely because I knew the scent of money eventually brings out the vultures, even if those vultures happen to carry your own last name. I had seen the entitlement growing in Cameron for years. Carter made sure they could never touch the real money. But the documents Melanie stole were a completely different breed of trap. Carter turned his monitor around to face me. The screen displayed a complex web of encrypted financial pathways. You need to fully understand what your daughter-in-law actually photographed. Douglas, he said softly. That ledger is not just a dummy file full of fake numbers. 5 years ago, I discovered a ring of executives actively embezzling from my international shipping routes. To catch them, Carter and I set a highly sophisticated snare. That specific offshore account number Melanie now holds is a radioactive honeypot. It was built specifically for a corporate sting operation, and it remains actively monitored by the United States Treasury Department. Carter leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk, ensuring I understood the absolute gravity of the situation. He explained that the account is permanently flagged. Any unauthorized attempt to wire funds from that specific routing number triggers an immediate automatic alert to federal financial fraud investigators. It does not go to local police. It does not warrant a polite phone call from a bank teller. It goes directly to the federal authorities. If Melanie tries to move a single dollar using your forged signature, she is committing a federal felony. Carter stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Wire fraud across international lines carries a mandatory minimum sentence. There is no reversing it once the request hits the servers. If she pushes that button, the machine takes over. The reality of his words hung in the quiet air of the office. Carter was offering me a choice. He pulled his keyboard closer. He told me he could easily freeze the account right now. He could put a hard lock on the routing number so any transfer attempt would simply bounce, resulting in an error message on Melanie's computer. He was giving me the option to save my son and his wife from a devastating federal indictment. He was asking if my blood tied my hands. I sat in the silence of that immaculate office and thought about the morning. I thought about Cameron sitting at my kitchen table aggressively agreeing that his father belonged in a locked care facility just so they could steal the roof over my head. I thought about Melanie buying expensive organic groceries she could not afford, smiling to my face, while actively trying to convince me my mind was rotting away. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my sanity, all to fuel their pathetic greed. They had shown me exactly who they were. I looked back at Carter. I did not blink. Leave the tripwire active, I told him. Do not block a single thing. Let the transfer go through to the secondary clearance stage. Carter held my gaze for a long moment, verifying that I understood the point of no return. You realize what will happen when she tries to move the money, he asked. If she wants to steal my life, let her pay the exact price, I replied. Carter nodded once. He typed a rapid sequence of commands into his computer, officially authorizing the open trap. The bait was completely live. Melanie had the forged key, the fake ledger, and the profound arrogance to believe she was the smartest person in the room. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the thief to snap the spring on her own fingers. The front door unlocked without a single knock. Cameron walked into my hallway, projecting a loud and entirely artificial cheerfulness. Behind him walked a man in a pristine navy suit holding a sleek leather briefcase. Cameron introduced the stranger as Dr. Vance. My son claimed he was a concierge neurologist, conducting complimentary in-home evaluations for elderly residents in our neighborhood. I did not need to ask for his credentials. My decades in corporate logistics required me to audit federal facility access badges on a daily basis. I looked at the laminated identification card dangling around the neck of this supposed doctor. It featured a generic red medical cross and a bold font, but it completely lacked the holographic state medical board seal. It had no secure microchip layout and no institutional barcode. The man standing in my living room was an absolute fraud. He was a paid grifter brought into my home to strip away my freedom. I did not raise my voice. I did not order them off my property. I smiled warmly and gestured for them to sit on my living room sofa. As I sat in my own armchair, my right hand slipped casually into my trouser pocket. I pressed the side button on my smartphone 3 times. The device vibrated once against my leg, confirming the hidden audio recorder was now actively capturing every single word spoken in the room. Dr. Vance opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal notepad. He leaned forward and began speaking to me in a slow, patronizing tone usually reserved for frightened children. He asked me to count backwards from 100 by sevens. He asked me to identify the current season and the name of the sitting president. I answered the first few questions correctly, to maintain a facade of trying my best. Cameron stood by the window with his arms tightly crossed, watching me with a look of starving anticipation. He needed me to fail. My own flesh and blood was praying for my mental collapse. The fraudulent doctor then shifted his tactic. He adopted a look of deep medical concern and brought up the car keys. He mentioned that Cameron and Melanie were very worried about my safety after I supposedly hid my keys inside the kitchen pantry. They were using Melanie's staged gaslighting event as clinical evidence. Vance asked me directly if I often found myself wandering the house without purpose, or if I felt a thick fog clouding my daily judgment. I knew exactly what they needed for their fabricated legal affidavit. I decided to hand them the rope they would use to hang themselves. I let my shoulders droop heavily. I stared down at my hands and allowed a slight manufactured tremor to shake my fingers. I lowered my voice into a fragile whisper. I told the fake doctor that the house felt too large lately. I confessed that I sometimes woke up and could not remember if it was morning or evening. I admitted that the incident with the keys had terrified me because my mind had simply gone completely blank. Cameron exhaled a loud breath of absolute relief. He turned away from the window and looked at Vance. The fake doctor nodded sharply. The trap was closing exactly as they had designed it. Vance scribbled furiously on his legal pad. He looked up at Cameron and stated with false clinical authority that my cognitive decline was accelerating at a dangerous pace. Vance explicitly said I was no longer fit to manage a household of this size or handle my own financial affairs. I sat quietly while my phone recorded every syllable. Cameron stepped forward and asked the fatal question. He asked Vance if an immediate transfer of power of attorney was the best course of action to protect my assets. Vance eagerly agreed. He advised Cameron on tape to secure legal control over my bank accounts and property deeds by the end of the week. He promised to sign the necessary medical declarations to fast-track the legal process. They were openly conspiring to medically kidnap me and steal my entire estate. I thanked Dr. Vance for his time and his compassion. I played the grateful, confused father perfectly. Cameron escorted the fraud out to his car, leaving me alone in the living room. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. The audio file was crystal clear. I securely uploaded it to my encrypted cloud server, ensuring Carter had immediate access to the felony conspiracy. My son believed he had just secured the keys to my kingdom. He did not realize he had just provided me with the exact ammunition required to destroy his life. The phone vibrated against the polished granite of the kitchen island. I did not rush to answer it. I let it buzz 3 times, watching the caller identification flash Carter's name across the screen. I picked up the receiver and brought it to my ear without saying a single word. Carter did not bother with a polite greeting. His voice was a low, steady hum of pure, concentrated adrenaline. "She pulled the trigger," he said. The words hung in the quiet space of my kitchen, heavy with the weight of absolute finality. Melanie had not just thought about it. She had not merely plotted or schemed in the shadows of my home. She had sat down at a computer, typed in the routing numbers from the decoy ledger she stole from my floor safe, and actively attempted to siphon a fortune from my estate. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet, manicured street. How much, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. $500,000, Carter replied. The sheer audacity of the number struck me. $500,000. It was not a quiet, stealthy theft. It was a massive smash-and-grab operation driven by a blinding, frantic urgency. Carter explained the mechanics of the trap with the precision of a surgeon describing an incision. The automated defense systems at the bank had flagged the transaction the absolute second it hit their servers. Melanie had uploaded a digital scan of the blank property deed she stole using the signature on it as authorization for the wire transfer. The forgery was clumsy, a desperate tracing job that did not even remotely match the sophisticated biometric security protocols I utilized for my authentic accounts. The bank's internal fraud department had immediately locked the request, assuming it was a brute force hack. But you overrode the freeze, I stated, knowing exactly how my attorney operated. I could practically hear Carter's cold smile through the receiver. I told the fraud department to lift the primary block, he confirmed. I instructed them to let the wire request process through the initial verification stage and float directly into the secondary clearance holding pattern. The money is completely suspended in the digital ether. It will never actually reach her, but by allowing it to enter the secondary stage, her digital fingerprints are permanently cemented into the federal banking registry. The Internet Protocol addressed the exact timestamp the forged signature upload. We have successfully captured every single metric. The trap had closed flawlessly. Melanie had just committed federal wire fraud across international lines. She had crossed a boundary that offered absolutely no retreat and no possibility of a quiet domestic resolution. The reality of the situation washed over me cold and absolute. My son's wife was now a documented felon. The psychological warfare she had waged in my living room, the fake neurologist she had brought into my home to legally strip away my freedom, it was all merely a prelude to this desperate act of financial violence. But a crucial piece of the puzzle remained missing. A thief motivated purely by greed usually tests the waters first. They siphon $10,000, maybe $20,000, to see if anyone notices the missing capital. Attempting to steal $500,000 in a single uncoordinated strike was not the behavior of a calculated embezzler. It was the chaotic thrashing of a drowning animal. Melanie was not just greedy, she was terrified. Where is she trying to send the money, I asked, turning away from the window and walking down the hallway toward the locked study. Carter paused, the sound of rapid keyboard clacking echoing slightly over the line. That is the detail that changes the entire landscape of this problem, he said, his tone dropping into a serious register. She did not attempt to wire the funds into her own personal checking account. She did not try to funnel it into a joint savings account she shares with Cameron. The destination routing number belongs to an opaque limited liability company registered out of state. It is a ghost corporation buried completely under layers of proxy ownership and dead-end addresses. I unlocked the heavy oak door of the study and stepped inside. The room was perfectly silent, the decoy safe completely untouched since her midnight intrusion. Why would she wire $500,000 to a shell company? I asked, staring at the Persian rug covering the floorboards. Because she owes them, Carter replied simply. Nobody attempts to steal that much liquid capital that fast, unless they have a gun to their head, either literally or metaphorically. Melanie is drowning in illicit debt. This was never just about upgrading her apartment or forcing you into a care facility so they could sell your house. She is trying to use your offshore assets to pay off a massive aggressive liability. If she had succeeded, she would have legally implicated your entire estate in laundering money for whatever syndicate operates that shell company. The betrayal deepened, mutating instantly from a petty domestic dispute into a severe legal threat against my entire legacy. Melanie was perfectly willing to drag my name and my life's work through the mud of a federal investigation just to save her own skin. And Cameron was standing right beside her, fully complicit, demanding I sign away my power of attorney while she robbed the vault. I walked over to the heavy leather chair behind my desk and sat down. The anger I felt was no longer a hot, burning thing. It was absolute zero. During my decades managing international logistics, I had dealt with shadow economies, black market shipping routes, and ruthless individuals. I knew exactly how these invisible networks operated. I needed to know exactly what kind of wolves were hunting my daughter-in-law. I needed to know whose cage she had stepped into so I could calculate the maximum amount of damage to inflict upon her. "Unleash your forensic accountants," I ordered Carter, my voice devoid of any hesitation or mercy. "Pierce the corporate veil of that shell company. Follow the routing numbers through every proxy and every dummy corporation until you find the actual names of the people holding her debt. I want to know who they are, how they operate, and exactly what happens to people who fail to pay them back." Carter agreed immediately, confirming his team was already tearing into the financial architecture of the receiving account, using the same tools we once used to protect my shipping routes. He promised to have a full dossier on the creditors by the end of the day. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the desktop. The silence of the study settled around me, heavy with impending consequence. The conflict had escalated beyond anything Cameron or Melanie could possibly comprehend. They thought they were playing a clever game of emotional manipulation against a deteriorating, defenseless old man. They had no idea they had just tripped a federal alarm alerting authorities and unseen predators alike. I sat in the stillness of my sanctuary, perfectly calm, waiting for Carter to deliver the final piece of intelligence. The snare had caught the thief, but before I called the authorities to collect her, I fully intended to discover exactly who she was running from. The morning air was thick with humidity as I walked down the driveway to the mailbox. I did not expect any anomalies today. I had my coffee in one hand and the brass key to the mailbox in the other. I opened the small metal door and pulled out a stack of generic envelopes. Most of it was standard junk mail, local grocery circulars and landscaping advertisements. But buried in the middle of the stack was a thick manila envelope. It was not addressed to me. It was addressed to Melanie. I stopped walking. I stared at her name printed in bold black ink across the front. She did not live here. She and Cameron had their own apartment clear across town. There was absolutely no logical reason for her to receive personal mail at my private residence, unless she was actively trying to hide something from her husband. Unless she needed a blind drop location that Cameron would never accidentally intercept. My house was simply another tool she was using to conceal her separate life. I did not bother marking it return to sender. I did not leave it on the counter for the next time they visited. I walked straight into the kitchen, grabbed a silver letter opener, and sliced the top of the envelope clean off. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. There was no corporate logo at the top. There was no polite greeting. It was a final notice of default. The header listed a company name I had not seen in over 15 years. Apex Financial Solutions. It sounded like a legitimate holding firm to the untrained ear. But during my decades managing international freight lines and maritime logistics, I had learned exactly who operated behind that specific corporate veil. They were not bankers. They did not report to credit bureaus. They were a highly organized syndicate of predatory lenders who operated entirely in the shadow economy. They catered exclusively to desperate people who had completely exhausted their legal financial options. I read the body of the letter. The numbers printed in bold red ink were staggering. Melanie owed them $200,000. The demand was explicit. The text did not threaten legal action or wage garnishment. Shadow creditors do not use the court system. The letter simply stated that the grace period had expired and a physical collection team would be dispatched to her primary residence by the end of the month to begin asset seizure. I laid the paper flat on the granite island and let the reality of the situation anchor itself in my mind. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed into place. 2 years ago, Melanie had confidently announced at a family dinner that she was launching a high-end boutique import business. She had spoken endlessly about securing exclusive European vendors and cornering the local luxury market. 6 months later, she abruptly stopped talking about it. Cameron told me she had simply lost interest and closed the venture down. Cameron was a fool. You do not just lose interest in a commercial lease and international supply chains. Melanie had utterly bankrupted the business. She had crashed the entire operation into the ground, and instead of admitting her failure to her husband, she had turned to the worst possible people to quietly cover her massive losses. She took a predatory loan to hide her incompetence, and the interest had finally swallowed her whole. This changed the entire landscape of her theft. The conflict was no longer just a greedy daughter-in-law trying to steal my retirement, to buy a nicer house or a faster car. Melanie was a desperate animal backed into a very dark corner. She was trying to use the $3.5 million from my decoy offshore ledger to pay off violent loan sharks. I felt a sudden chilling realization wash over me. I walked over to the kitchen sink and gripped the cold porcelain edge. The trap Carter and I had set was designed to catch a simple embezzler. The federal wire fraud tripwire would trigger the moment she tried to transfer the funds to a domestic bank. But Melanie was not wiring the money to a normal bank. She was attempting to route $500,000 from an account bearing my forged signature directly into the coffers of a known criminal syndicate. If that transaction fully cleared the secondary stage of the federal monitoring system, the Treasury Department would not just arrest Melanie for theft. They would see a direct financial bridge between my estate and a violent racketeering operation. By trying to save her own skin, Melanie was unknowingly pulling my name into a massive federal money laundering investigation. The government would not politely ask for my side of the story. They would freeze every single legitimate asset I owned. They would seize my home, my pensions, and my actual secure trusts while they spent years untangling the fraudulent mess she created. She was carrying a lit match into an ammunition depot. I let go of the sink and picked up my phone. I dialed Carter. The line rang barely once before he answered. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him about the intercepted letter. I told him about Apex Financial Solutions and the $200,000 in illicit debt. I explained exactly what Melanie was trying to do with the wire transfer she initiated yesterday. Carter was silent for a long moment. I could hear the sharp intake of his breath. The legal implications hit his brilliant mind instantly. If those funds touch the syndicate accounts, they will drag your entire financial history into a federal subpoena. He stated, his voice tight with genuine alarm. We need to kill the wire transfer immediately, Douglas. We need to shut the offshore account down and wipe the authorization completely clean before the morning clearance cycle finishes. No, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register. We are not shutting it down. Douglas, you are playing an incredibly dangerous game, Carter warned. You are letting a blindfolded woman juggle live grenades inside your house. If we do not stop that wire, the collateral damage to your life could be catastrophic. I turned around and looked at the final notice sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about the sheer arrogance of this woman coming into my home, drinking my coffee, and smiling in my face while actively planning to sacrifice my entire existence to save herself. I was not going to let her walk away from this with a simple declined transaction. I told Carter to monitor the wire transfer personally. I instructed him to let the funds move out of the offshore holding pattern, but to immediately intercept and quarantine the money in a blind federal escrow account, the absolute second it tried to dock with the syndicate. I wanted the federal authorities to see the transaction leave her computer. I wanted them to see the destination she chose, but I would not let the money actually land in the hands of the predators. Carter understood the maneuver perfectly. You want the feds to arrest her for attempting the transfer, but you want the syndicate to realize she completely failed to pay them, he said. Exactly, I replied. She wanted to use my life as a shield. I am going to make sure she faces the government on one side and the wolves on the other. Prepare the escrow intercept, Carter. I am going to let her burn her own world to the ground. The tracking application on my phone pulsed with a steady rhythmic ping. I had slipped a micro-tracking beacon into the lining of Cameron's coat during the Sunday dinner. It was a simple precaution, but it was currently guiding me directly toward the absolute death of my family line. I parked my car across the street from a gleaming glass and steel showroom. The massive silver logo of a high-end European auto manufacturer caught the afternoon sun. It was a place of extreme luxury, a place where a man drowning in apartment rent had absolutely no business walking through the front doors. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin of my car. I needed to know exactly what my son was doing. I needed to know if he was merely a blind fool being dragged into ruin by a desperate wife, or if he was actively steering the ship. I reached up and deliberately ruffled my hair. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my shirt, pulling the collar askew. I stepped out of the vehicle and immediately altered my posture. I let my shoulders slump forward. I dragged my feet slightly, letting my shoes scuff against the pavement. I was no longer the calculated logistics director. I was the fragile, wandering old man they desperately wanted me to be. The showroom doors slid open silently. The air inside smelled of expensive leather and polished rubber. A young salesman in a sharp-tailored suit immediately spotted me. His professional smile faltered as he took in my disheveled appearance. He took a step forward, clearly intending to intercept the confused senior citizen before I could smudge the pristine paint on the display vehicles. I did not give him the chance to speak. I widened my eyes and let my hands tremble. "I am looking for my boy," I whispered, letting a note of rising panic crack my voice. He told me to wait in the car, but it was getting too hot. "His name is Cameron. He is buying a car." The salesman relaxed instantly, his suspicion melting into patronizing pity. He gently touched my elbow and pointed toward the rear of the showroom. "Your son is right over there in the finance office, sir. Just past the silver convertible. Do you need me to walk you over?" I shook my head slowly and thanked him, shuffling away with a fabricated limp. I navigated the polished floor, keeping the massive body of the display vehicle between myself and the glass-walled office. I positioned myself beside a tall, promotional banner, perfectly concealed, but well within earshot of the open office door. Cameron was sitting in a plush leather chair across from a senior finance manager. My son looked entirely at ease. He was casually swirling a complimentary espresso in a small ceramic cup. He was radiating the kind of arrogant entitlement that only comes from unearned wealth. The finance manager tapped his pen against a thick stack of paperwork. "The credit check is a bit complicated, Cameron," he said, maintaining a polite but firm tone. "You are currently carrying a significant amount of unsecured debt, and your housing history shows some recent turbulence. We are looking at $120,000 for the custom build. The dealership requires a substantial collateral hold to approve a bridge loan of this magnitude." I waited in the shadow of the banner, holding my breath. This was the precipice. This was the moment my son would either walk away or step willingly into the abyss. Cameron did not hesitate. He let out a soft, condescending laugh. "The credit history is just a temporary bottleneck," he said, his voice dripping with supreme confidence. "My wife and I are currently restructuring our family estate. My father is completely transitioning his assets over to us. He is moving into a care facility very soon. His mind is basically gone." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I did not move a single muscle. My son was using my fabricated mental decline as a financial bargaining chip. He was selling my sanity to buy a sports car. Cameron reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a heavy, folded document and tossed it casually onto the glass desk. I watched the finance manager unfold the thick parchment. I recognized the seal instantly. It was the blank, pre-signed property deed Melanie had stolen from my decoy floor safe. "That is the deed to my father's 4-bedroom house," Cameron stated, leaning back and crossing his legs. "It is fully paid off. It appraises at over $800,000. He signed it over to me this morning. You can hold the deed in escrow as physical collateral against the vehicle financing until the offshore liquid funds clear our accounts next week." The manager looked over the document. He traced his finger over my forged signature. The forgery was a crude imitation of my handwriting, but to a car salesman eager to close a massive commission, it was perfectly acceptable. The manager smiled and slid a final purchase agreement across the desk. "If you can just sign right here as the primary guarantor," the manager said, handing Cameron a heavy silver pen. I watched my son take the pen. I watched the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through college. I watched him sign his name next to my forged signature, actively committing grand larceny against his own blood. He was not a victim of Melanie and her hidden debts. He was a willing co-conspirator. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he felt absolutely no remorse. The emotional tie that binds a father to a son is incredibly resilient. It can survive anger, disappointment, and prolonged absence. But it cannot survive the cold, calculated blade of pure, parasitic betrayal. As I stood in the quiet luxury of that showroom watching Cameron shake hands with the finance manager, the final fraying thread of my paternal forgiveness snapped completely. It did not make a sound. It simply ceased to exist. I turned away from the office. I did not drop the confused shuffle until I was safely out the sliding glass doors and halfway down the block. I climbed back into my car and gripped the steering wheel. The conflict had shifted its axis permanently. I was no longer fighting to save my son from a predatory wife. I was fighting to eradicate them both from my legacy. The trap was now fully loaded with enough federal offenses to ensure neither of them would ever see the inside of my house again. I started the engine and drove away, leaving them to blindly celebrate a victory that would ultimately serve as their prison sentence. The afternoon sun cast long, thick shadows across the paved driveway as I sat at the granite kitchen island, carefully watching the high-definition security feed on my tablet. The entire house was perfectly silent. I had deliberately parked my vehicle 2 streets over to create the complete illusion that the property was totally abandoned for the day. I knew with absolute certainty that she would come back. The wire transfer she had attempted the previous afternoon had been intercepted and quarantined in a blind federal escrow account by my attorney. Melanie had promised her shadow creditors at Apex Financial Solutions a payment of $200,000 by the end of the month, and she had utterly failed to deliver the funds. Desperation is a highly predictable and dangerous emotion. It strips away logic and forces people to make reckless physical mistakes. The motion sensor on the front porch camera detected movement. A silver sedan pulled aggressively into the driveway, tires scraping against the concrete. Melanie stepped out of the vehicle, looking frantically up and down the quiet suburban street. She was not carrying her usual expensive designer handbag or wearing her pristine socialite smile. She was clutching a large, empty canvas tote bag, and her posture was rigid with absolute panic. The loan sharks were demanding their money, and she desperately needed more physical paper to feed their appetite. She walked rapidly up the brick steps to the front porch and slid her forged brass key into the deadbolt. The lock clicked open with a heavy metallic sound. I watched her step into the foyer through the hallway camera lens. She did not bother calling out my name to check if I was home resting in the living room. She did not stop in the kitchen to pretend she was dropping off groceries for her ailing father-in-law. She walked with a singular, frantic purpose straight toward the closed doors of my private study. She needed more account numbers. She needed to find stock certificates or physical property bonds or tax documents. She needed to find absolutely anything she could photograph and send to the syndicate to prove she was still a viable asset, capable of paying her illicit debts. She reached the heavy solid oak door of my study and pushed it wide open. She stepped inside the room and reached across the desk for the brass reading lamp. That was exactly the moment I pressed a single digital button on my tablet screen. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, propelled by the automated pneumatic safety hinges I had installed late last year. A loud, heavy mechanical thud echoed through the silent house as the electronic deadbolt instantly slid deep into the reinforced steel doorframe. I pressed a second digital button on my screen. The smart breakers located in the basement instantly severed all electrical power to the study circuit. The brass reading lamp on the desk went entirely dead. The overhead recessed lights shut off completely, Melanie was suddenly and violently plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. I switched the camera feed to the infrared night vision mode. The screen illuminated the enclosed study in a pale, ghostly green glow. I watched my daughter-in-law freeze completely in the center of the room. She stood perfectly still for 10 full seconds, waiting for her eyes to adjust to a darkness that would simply not yield. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the glass screen frantically, but the device remained dark and disconnected from any cellular network. I had previously installed a military-grade signal jammer in the floorboards directly beneath the study to protect my corporate logistics servers from wireless intrusion. Her phone was completely useless in that room. She was entirely cut off from the outside world. She stumbled blindly toward the doorway. Her flat palms patted heavily against the smooth wood until she finally found the heavy brass door handle. She pushed down on the metal lever, but the internal mechanism was rigidly locked in place. She jiggled the handle twice in rapid succession. Then she pulled it with both hands, using the entire weight of her body, leaning backward. The solid steel deadbolt did not move a single millimeter. I watched her chest begin to heave rapidly on the green-tinted security screen. The terrifying reality of her physical situation was crashing down heavily on her lungs. She was trapped inside a sensory deprivation vault with a syndicate of violent loan sharks waiting for a phone call she could no longer make. The psychological pressure cooker began to completely crush her fragile composure. She started pulling at the brass handle with a violent and frantic rhythm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails scraped heavily and loudly against the polished metal. She dropped her canvas tote bag onto the floor and pressed both hands flat against the hard wood. She began scratching at the doorframe like a trapped and panicked animal. I watched the sharp acrylic tips of her nails dig deep, visible grooves into the expensive oak paneling. She was hyperventilating severely now. Her mouth was open wide in a silent scream of absolute terror. She was rapidly losing her mind in the suffocating dark. I set a digital timer on my wristwatch. I wanted to hold her inside that dark, silent box for exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes is an absolute eternity when you are drowning in a pitch-black room, unable to breathe and unable to call for any outside assistance. I watched her slide slowly down the heavy oak door until she was sitting flat on the carpet. She brought her knees tightly to her chest and rocked back and forth in the dark. Her hands were bleeding slightly from fiercely clawing at the rigid brass and splintered wood. She was mere seconds away from letting out a piercing, hysterical scream that would easily echo out to the street and alert the neighboring houses. I did not want the local police arriving for a domestic noise complaint. I wanted her to leave quietly and carry this profound psychological terror directly back to her husband. Just as she opened her mouth to scream, I pressed the unlock button on my tablet. The electronic deadbolt snapped back with a loud and sudden mechanical clack. The pneumatic hinges slowly pushed the heavy oak door open outward, spilling the warm, bright afternoon sunlight directly into the pitch-black study. Melanie scrambled backward across the carpet like a frightened insect. She stared at the open, illuminated doorway in absolute shock. She did not look back at the desk or attempt to retrieve her abandoned canvas tote bag. She scrambled clumsily to her feet and ran blindly down the hallway. I listened to her heavy, frantic footsteps pound against the hardwood floors. The front door slammed violently shut, shaking the walls. Through the exterior camera feed, I watched her sprint across the manicured lawn, throw herself wildly into her silver sedan, and speed away down the suburban street without ever looking back. I set my tablet down on the kitchen island and walked slowly down the hallway. I approached the open door of the study and looked very closely at the heavy brass door handle. It was entirely covered in deep, erratic scratches. The beautiful oak paneling surrounding the lock mechanism was severely gouged and badly splintered by her fingernails. She had left her physical desperation permanently carved into the architecture of my home. I pulled out my phone and took 24 high-resolution photographs of the extensive damage. I photographed the discarded canvas bag resting empty on my Persian rug. The digital wire transfer attempt gave Carter the federal evidence he needed to prove financial fraud. But these deep, jagged scratches heavily carved into my solid oak door provided the undeniable physical evidence of a forced entry and malicious property damage. The silent trap had not merely frightened her. It had successfully forced her to leave her own frantic fingerprints directly at the scene of the crime. The heavy oak front door did not simply open. It shuddered violently against its hinges. I was sitting quietly at the kitchen island when the sudden noise fractured the silence of the house. Heavy, desperate footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor of the foyer. Cameron marched directly into the kitchen. He did not bother to remove his shoes or offer a greeting. He looked entirely unraveled. The polished veneer of the successful businessman had melted away completely. His tie was loosened and his collar was damp with sweat. His eyes were wide and framed by dark circles of severe stress. He was a man suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing world. He marched straight to the granite counter and slammed a thick stack of legal papers down in front of me. The sudden violent sound echoed sharply off the kitchen tiles. I looked down at the pristine white pages. I did not need to read the fine print to understand what lay before me. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney document. It was a legal guillotine designed to sever me from every single asset, every bank account, and every piece of property I had spent my entire adult life building. Beside the document, Cameron slammed a heavy silver pen. He leaned over the counter, placing his hands flat against the cold stone. His breathing was ragged and shallow. He ordered me to sign the papers immediately. His voice was not steady. It vibrated with a frantic, manic energy. He told me that the time for discussions was over, and that I needed to hand over control of the estate before my mind deteriorated any further. I sat perfectly still on my stool. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not even look at the signature line. I looked directly into the eyes of my youngest child. I searched his face for any lingering trace of the boy I had raised. I looked for the son who used to sit at this very counter, struggling with his mathematics homework, while I patiently guided him through the equations. I looked for the boy I had carried on my shoulders during summer festivals. But that boy was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollow, desperate stranger who viewed my existence as nothing more than a financial obstacle. Cameron interpreted my silence as the confusion of a deteriorating old man. He slammed his hand against the counter again, demanding my attention. He leaned closer until I could smell the stale coffee and bitter anxiety radiating off his skin. He told me that I was leaving him with no other choice. He lowered his voice into a cruel and calculated register. He brought up the fraudulent medical evaluation we had conducted in my living room just days ago. He reminded me of the fake neurologist and the clinical notes regarding my supposed rapid cognitive decline. Cameron stated that the doctor had officially certified me as a severe danger to myself. My son looked me dead in the eyes and laid out his ultimate threat. He told me that if I did not pick up the pen and sign my life away right this second, he would pull out his phone and call Adult Protective Services. He painted a vivid and horrifying picture of what would happen next. He described uniformed state workers arriving at my front door with a mandatory psychiatric hold. He detailed how they would force me out of the home I had built and drag me into a locked state facility for the elderly. He told me I would be stripped of my dignity, my privacy, and my freedom. He promised that strangers would pack up my belongings while I spent my final years trapped in a tiny clinical room with a roommate and a scheduled bedtime. He delivered these threats with a cold, methodical cruelty intended to paralyze me with absolute terror. He was trying to use the deepest fears of any elderly parent to force my capitulation. He wanted me to believe that signing the power of attorney was my only route to a peaceful twilight. He believed his trap was perfectly constructed and utterly inescapable. He had no idea that his entire reality was resting on a foundation of federal wire fraud and actively monitored decoy accounts. He had no idea that his own wife had recently fled this very house in tears after failing to secure the funds to save them from a violent criminal syndicate. He had no idea that I had stood in a luxury car showroom and watched him eagerly leverage my forged signature to finance a sports car. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to the horrifying images he had just painted. I let a long, heavy silence fill the space between us. I watched the frantic energy in his eyes slowly curdle into confusion. I slowly placed my hands flat on the granite counter and stood up from the stool. I squared my shoulders and stood at my full height, looking down at the man who was desperately trying to steal my life. "I refuse," I said. My voice was entirely devoid of warmth. It contained no anger and no sorrow. It was a dead, icy calm that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. The two words hung in the air with the weight of a judge dropping a wooden gavel. Cameron stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. He looked at the unsigned document and back at my face. He had expected me to beg. He had expected me to cry and plead to stay in my home. He had anticipated a frightened old man eagerly signing the paper to avoid a terrifying state facility. He was completely unprepared for a stone-cold refusal. "Sign the paper right now," he demanded again, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You are forcing my hand. I will make the call. I will have them take you away today." I did not blink. I did not move a single inch. "Make the call," then I replied, my tone perfectly flat. "Do whatever you feel you must do. But I will never sign that document. You will not touch my estate. You will not control my finances. You have nothing left to take from me." The finality in my voice pierced through his frantic delusions. He finally understood that the manipulation had failed completely. The frightened old man routine was over. The father he thought he could easily discard was standing before him as an immovable wall. The realization twisted his features into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He snatched the silver pen off the counter and aggressively shoved the legal document back into his leather briefcase. "You will regret this," he snarled, his voice vibrating with venom. He turned around and marched heavily down the hallway. I listened to his rapid footsteps echo against the walls. The heavy oak front door opened and slammed shut with a violent force that rattled the picture frames in the foyer. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The air was finally clear. The final battle line was permanently drawn into the earth. My son had played his last desperate card and completely failed. There was no more waiting and no more gathering evidence. It was time to close the trap and let the consequences of his actions completely consume him. I sat on the sturdy wooden chair on my back porch and watched the late afternoon sun sink slowly below the distant tree line. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh-cut grass. The violent emotional storms that had plagued my house for the past several weeks were completely gone. I held a sweating glass of iced tea in my hand and listened to the gentle rustle of the oak leaves moving in the wind. There was a profound stillness settling over my property. It was the kind of deep, immovable peace that only arrives after a massive structural collapse. The foundation of my family had been completely excavated and the rotten wood had been burned away. I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I did not feel the heavy, crushing weight of betrayal anymore. I only felt the clean, empty space where my son used to reside in my heart. The snare was fully deployed, and the predators were firmly caught in the steel teeth of their own making. My smartphone began to vibrate violently against the small glass table next to my chair. The screen illuminated the darkening porch with a harsh white glow. The caller identification displayed Cameron's name in bold black letters. I let the device rattle against the glass for a long moment, watching it shake back and forth. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the cold, bitter taste. I placed the heavy glass down on a coaster and finally picked up the phone. I pressed the green button and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not say a single word to encourage him. I simply sat in the quiet twilight and listened to the chaos unfolding on the other end of the line. The sound that came through the speaker was not the smooth, arrogant voice of the man who had slammed a power of attorney document onto my kitchen counter just hours earlier. It was a high-pitched, frantic sound. It was the sound of a terrified animal caught in a trap that was slowly crushing its ribs. Cameron was hyperventilating so severely that his words were initially completely incoherent. He was gasping for air and stumbling over his own frantic sentences. I listened to his desperate, shallow breathing and waited for him to form a cohesive thought. The background noise on his end was loud and chaotic. I could hear heavy boots moving rapidly across a hardwood floor and the sharp, commanding voices of men shouting strict orders. "Dad," he finally gasped, his voice cracking violently. "Dad, you have to help us right now. Please, you have to do something." I remained perfectly silent, letting the weight of my quiet breathing press against his panic. The lack of a response seemed to push him further into absolute hysteria. He began speaking in a rapid, disjointed rush of terrifying details. He told me that Melanie had gone back into my study yesterday afternoon. He said she found the offshore ledger and tried to wire $500,000 to clear her business debts. He was sobbing openly now, a wet, pathetic sound. He confessed that the bank did not just decline the transaction. They had completely frozen every single financial account tied to their names. Their checking accounts, their savings, their credit lines, their retirement portfolios were all locked down tight by an automated federal hold. They had zero access to any liquid capital. They could not even buy a tank of gasoline, but that was only the beginning of his devastation. Cameron let out a strangled cry. He told me that less than 10 minutes ago, 2 dark sport utility vehicles had parked aggressively on the lawn in front of their apartment complex. Men in tactical windbreakers had just pounded on their front door and forced their way inside. He said they were federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. The government was standing in his living room right this very second. They were holding printed federal warrants and actively seizing their computers and mobile phones. The agents were treating the wire transfer attempt as an active international money laundering operation. The trap Carter and I had meticulously constructed had snapped shut with terrifying federal precision. Cameron was begging me now. The arrogance he had displayed at the luxury car dealership when he casually handed over my forged property deed was entirely evaporated. The cruel entitlement he wielded when he threatened to lock me in a state medical facility was completely gone. He was crying like a frightened child, begging his father to make the scary monsters go away. He pleaded with me to get in my car and drive to their apartment immediately. He begged me to talk to the federal agents standing in his hallway. He wanted me to look those highly trained investigators in the eye and tell them it was all just a massive family misunderstanding. He laid out his desperate, fabricated story, hoping I would blindly adopt it. He wanted me to claim that I had willingly authorized the massive offshore wire transfer. He needed me to lie to the federal government and state that I had given Melanie my absolute blessing to move the $500,000 to save them from the predatory lenders. He told me that if I just corroborated their story, the agents would leave and the felony charges would simply disappear into thin air. He promised that they would never bother me again. He swore that they would leave me in peace if I just saved them from federal prison and the violent loan sharks waiting in the shadows. He was asking me to commit federal perjury to cover up his active attempt to steal my entire estate. He was asking me to shield the very people who had ruthlessly planned to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward and strip me of my human dignity. I sat on my porch and listened to my son beg for salvation. I thought about the fake neurologist standing in my living room, trying to trick me into failing a cognitive test. I thought about Melanie clawing frantically at the brass handle of my locked study door like a feral beast. I thought about Cameron sitting in a sleek leather chair, putting my home up for collateral so he could drive a luxury sports car. Cameron was currently surrounded by aggressive wolves of his own invitation, and he wanted me to throw my own body into the pack to satisfy their hunger. I looked out at the dark tree line. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear night sky, piercing through the fading twilight. The air around me was perfectly still. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean evening breeze. I felt absolutely no obligation to this panicking stranger crying on the phone. The biological connection between us had been completely severed by his own relentless, bottomless greed. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt the profound clarity of absolute, total closure. I brought the phone closer to my mouth. I kept my voice entirely level and devoid of any emotional warmth. It was a cold, flat statement of undeniable fact. "I do not authorize felonies," I said. I moved my thumb and pressed the red button on the glass screen, cutting off his frantic sobbing instantly. The sudden silence on the wooden porch was incredibly beautiful. I placed the mobile phone face down on the glass table, ensuring I would not see if he attempted to call back. I picked up my heavy glass of iced tea and took another slow, rewarding sip. The ice clinked gently against the rim, creating a soft, musical chime in the quiet air. I sat back in my wooden chair, rested my hands in my lap, and watched the stars burn brightly in the endless dark sky. The storm was finally over, and my house was entirely my own. I drove through the darkening city streets with a singular and unyielding purpose. The transition from my quiet suburban neighborhood to the towering glass and steel structures of the downtown district felt like crossing into a completely different world. Cameron and Melanie had chosen to live in a luxury high-rise penthouse that overlooked the financial sector. They wanted to project an image of supreme success and untouchable wealth. They furnished their apartment with imported Italian leather and abstract art they did not understand. They spent thousands of dollars every single month just to maintain the illusion that they belonged among the elite. All the while they were drowning in illicit debt and plotting to steal the modest home I had paid off decades ago through honest labor. I navigated my truck through the empty intersections while the streetlights washed over my windshield in a steady, rhythmic pattern. I did not feel any anxiety or regret. I only felt the cold and absolute clarity of a man arriving to inspect a finalized demolition. The trap had been triggered, and the resulting shockwave was currently tearing their artificial world apart. I pulled my truck into the circular driveway of their exclusive building. The valet stand was completely abandoned. The polished marble entrance was blocked by 3 massive black sport utility vehicles. The vehicles were parked aggressively across the pristine driveway at sharp, unnatural angles. The federal license plates bolted to the bumpers confirmed that Carter had executed the final maneuver perfectly. I left my truck running by the curb and walked through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The normal atmosphere of hushed exclusivity had been completely shattered. The uniformed concierge was standing frozen behind his mahogany desk, watching the elevators with wide and terrified eyes. He did not ask for my identification or attempt to stop me. He simply stood there in stunned silence while I walked past him and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. The elevator ride was perfectly silent. I watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher into the sky. When the metal doors finally slid open, the silence was instantly replaced. A loud and systematic chaos. The wide hallway was flooded with men and women wearing dark, tactical windbreakers. Bold yellow letters spelling out the names of federal financial crime divisions were printed across their backs. They were moving in and out of my son and his wife, entirely consumed by ruthless mechanical efficiency. I stood in the hallway and watched the immediate consequences of pure, unadulterated greed unfold before my eyes. An agent walked past me carrying a heavy plastic storage bin filled with financial documents and scattered banking statements. Another agent carried Cameron's expensive computer tower secured tightly inside a transparent, anti-static evidence bag. They were dismantling my son's entire life piece by piece. They were stripping away the fake luxury and boxing up the undeniable proof of their crimes. I stepped slowly into the foyer of the apartment. The living room was a scene of total devastation. The expensive designer cushions were thrown onto the floor. The abstract paintings were removed from the walls and stacked carelessly against the windows. The drawers of their sleek modern desk had been pulled out and emptied onto the expensive imported rugs. In the center of the chaotic living room stood Melanie. Her carefully crafted socialite persona was completely shattered. Her expensive silk blouse was rumpled and untucked. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled and frantic mess, falling wildly across her face. She was completely unraveled and breathing in heavy, shallow gasps. She was clutching a thick stack of printed photographs in her trembling hands. I recognized the images instantly from across the room. They were the color photographs she had taken of the decoy ledger inside my locked study. They were the pictures of the radioactive routing numbers and the fabricated offshore trust accounts. She was holding them tightly against her chest, like a physical shield against the federal agents surrounding her. She turned her head and saw me standing quietly in the doorway. The sheer terror in her eyes instantly mutated into a wild and blinding rage. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. She screamed at the agents that they were making a massive mistake. She yelled that they were arresting the wrong people and that I was the actual mastermind behind the entire operation. Her voice echoed harshly off the high ceilings, bouncing around the empty walls of the penthouse. She shrieked that I was a criminal hiding millions of dollars in illegal offshore accounts to avoid federal taxes. She waved the printed photographs frantically in the air, claiming that she had broken into my study simply to expose my massive financial crimes. She demanded that the agents put the handcuffs on me instead of her. She tried to shove the stack of photographs directly into the chest of a towering federal agent standing in front of her. She sobbed and begged him to look at the numbers printed on the pages. She swore the pictures proved that I was laundering money and that she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. She claimed she was just trying to protect her family from my dangerous shadow economy dealings. The federal agent did not even blink. He did not look at the photographs, and he did not look at me. Carter had already provided the Joint Task Force with the comprehensive and certified dossier detailing every single aspect of their fraud. The authorities already possessed the verified surveillance footage from my living room, showing the fake medical evaluation. They already had the documented proof of the predatory loans Melanie had taken from the violent shadow syndicate. They had the precise digital tracking data showing the exact moment Melanie attempted to wire $500,000 from her personal laptop using my forged signature. The agent knew exactly who the criminal in the room was, and he was completely unaffected by her theatrical desperation. The agent reached out and calmly took the crumpled photographs from her trembling hands. He did not read them or acknowledge her frantic accusations. He simply folded the glossy papers in half and dropped them casually into a clear plastic evidence bag hanging from his heavy tactical belt. Melanie watched her only defense disappear into the plastic pouch. She opened her mouth to scream again, but the agent stepped forward and firmly grabbed her by the shoulder. He spun her around with a rough and practiced motion. He pulled her arms behind her back and pressed her wrists tightly together. The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking shut echoed sharply across the ruined living room. It was a cold and undeniable sound of absolute finality. The relentless cycle of manipulation and deceit was officially over. Melanie collapsed entirely. Her knees buckled beneath her, and two agents had to hold her upright by her arms just to keep her from hitting the floor. She hung her head and began to sob hysterically, letting out a wet and defeated wail that filled the vast apartment. I looked away from her and found Cameron. My son was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa in the far corner of the room. His head was buried deep in his hands. He did not look up at me. He did not try to defend his wife or offer any explanation for his actions. He simply sat in the wreckage of his own arrogant choices, waiting for his turn in the heavy steel handcuffs. He had traded his family for the illusion of wealth, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. I turned around and walked out of the apartment, leaving them completely behind in the ruins of their own making. The federal agents moving through the ruined penthouse did not pause their methodical work when Melanie screamed her accusations. They ignored her frantic shrieks, completely continuing to inventory the shattered remains of her fabricated luxury. Her desperate attempt to shift the blame was entirely useless against the grinding machinery of a federal raid. She stood in the center of the devastated living room, panting heavily, while the cold steel handcuffs locked her wrists together behind her back. She stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, waiting for the authorities to realize their mistake and arrest me. I did not raise my voice or react to her wild performance. I simply stepped forward over the scattered designer cushions and approached the large glass coffee table resting in the middle of the room. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored coat and pulled out a pristine manila folder. It was perfectly smooth and entirely untouched by the chaos surrounding us. I held it in my hand for a brief moment, letting the sheer gravity of its contents settle over the room. Then I dropped the folder directly onto the center of the heavy glass table. The sharp slapping sound of the thick paper striking the hard surface cut through the background noise of the raid like a gunshot. The sudden noise commanded absolute attention. Two of the agents standing nearby stopped boxing up financial records and turned to look. Cameron slowly lifted his face from his hands. Melanie flinched as if the sound had physically struck her. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law and began to speak. I pitched my voice perfectly so that it carried across the entire living room, ensuring that every single federal investigator present could hear every word I said. I told Melanie that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I explained that when she broke into my locked study and frantically photographed the numbers in that ledger, she truly believed she had uncovered my hidden fortune. She believed she had found an illegal stockpile of untaxed wealth that she could easily siphon to pay off her violent shadow creditors. I watched her pale face twitch as I laid out her exact thought process. She had assumed I was just as greedy and corrupt as she was. I pointed to the pristine folder resting on the glass table. I explained that the ledger she found did not belong to a secret personal savings account. It was the central component of a dormant corporate sting operation. I let that revelation hang in the quiet air. I slowly detailed the history she had never bothered to learn. Years ago, during my tenure as a corporate logistics director, my firm had cooperated directly with the United States Treasury Department to build a financial honeypot. We had designed a trap specifically intended to catch aggressive offshore embezzlers. That account was a ghost ship strictly monitored by federal authorities and equipped with silent digital alarms. I had kept the ledger locked in my study as a relic of my corporate career, never intending to activate it again. Melanie stared at me with her mouth slightly open. The arrogant certainty in her eyes began to fracture and dissolve. I continued my explanation, breaking down the mechanics of the trap she had blindly walked into. I told her that breaking into my study and photographing the documents was merely a localized trespassing charge. The simple act of looking at the ledger was not enough to summon the federal government to her doorstep. To trigger the massive response currently tearing her penthouse apart, she had to take a definitive and aggressive action. She had to actively reach out and touch the live wire. I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice into a cold and unyielding register. I delivered the absolute truth with merciless precision. I told her that the moment she typed those specific routing numbers into her laptop, she sealed her own fate. But the fatal blow was the signature. I explained that the moment you forged my signature to transfer those funds, you committed a federal felony. She had not simply attempted to steal money from an old man. She had attempted to wire $500,000 from a federally quarantined and heavily monitored Treasury account directly to a known criminal syndicate. She had practically handed the government a perfectly documented map bridging domestic wire fraud with international money laundering. The realization washed over her like a freezing tidal wave. Her arrogant facade did not just crack, it shattered into absolute hollow despair. The manic energy that had fueled her screaming accusations completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a woman who finally understood she had dug her own grave and willingly jumped inside. Her knees buckled beneath her. The federal agent holding her arm had to brace his stance to keep her from collapsing onto the expensive rug. She hung her head and began to weep in quiet, breathless gasps. There was no more defiance left in her. She was entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of her own colossal stupidity. Cameron stared at me from the leather sofa. His face was a mask of total devastation. He looked at the manila folder on the glass table, and then up at me. He finally understood the vast intellectual disparity between us. He had thought I was a deteriorating old man waiting to be institutionalized. He had believed he could easily bully me into signing away my life. Instead, I had patiently engineered a flawless checkmate using his own desperate greed as the primary weapon. He realized that his wife had not only failed to save them from the loan sharks, but she had actively summoned the federal government to ensure they would spend the next decade in a concrete cell. He buried his face back into his hands and began to sob openly. The lead federal agent walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up the pristine manila folder. He opened it carefully and reviewed the verified Treasury documents and the certified corporate declarations I had provided. He compared the account numbers in my file with the frozen digital transfer logs they had already intercepted. He looked up from the papers and gave me a brief acknowledging nod. The evidence was absolute and incontrovertible. The chain of custody was perfectly clean. The agent turned to his team and ordered them to process the prisoners for immediate transport to the federal holding facility. I stood in the center of the ruined penthouse for one final moment. I did not feel any triumphant joy or sadistic pleasure. I only felt the deep, immovable satisfaction of a restored natural order. They had sought to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my freedom simply to finance their toxic illusions of grandeur. They had treated my lifelong sacrifices as a convenient resource to be plundered. Now they were being hauled away in steel chains, entirely stripped of the false luxury they had sacrificed their souls to maintain. I turned my back on the weeping couple and walked toward the open elevator doors. I left them surrounded by federal agents and the absolute wreckage of their own catastrophic hubris. I stopped just short of the elevator bank. The polished metal doors had not yet opened to offer my escape. Heavy, frantic footsteps slapped against the polished hardwood floor behind me. Cameron had managed to pull himself away from the terrifying reality of the federal raid currently unfolding in his living room. He ran down the long penthouse hallway and intercepted me before I could step into the descending cabin. He threw himself directly in front of the metallic doors, blocking my only physical exit. His face was stained with sweat, and his eyes were wide with the primal terror of a cornered animal. He reached out and grabbed the sleeves of my coat with trembling hands. His fingers dug into the heavy fabric with a desperate, crushing grip. He began to beg me for immediate salvation. He threw his wife entirely to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. He sobbed and pleaded that he had absolutely no idea what Melanie had been doing behind closed doors. He claimed that she was a masterful manipulator who had completely blinded him to her massive financial crimes. He swore on his own life that he had absolutely no knowledge of the violent shadow creditors or the illicit offshore wire transfers. He painted himself as a naive and trusting husband who had been cruelly deceived by a greedy and desperate woman. He begged me to walk back into that ruined living room and tell the federal agents that he was completely innocent. He wanted me to use my influence to shield him from the inevitable prison sentence that was currently boxing up his entire existence. He cried that he was my only son and that I could not possibly let the government take him away for crimes he did not actively commit. His cowardice was absolutely staggering to witness. He was entirely willing to watch the woman he married be hauled away in federal chains as long as he could remain safely in his luxury apartment. I looked down at his shaking hands gripping my coat. I did not physically push him away. I simply stared at his trembling fingers until he felt the freezing weight of my gaze and slowly released his hold. He stepped backward, rubbing his hands nervously against his expensive trousers. I reached into my coat pocket and slowly withdrew my smartphone. The device felt heavy and solid in my palm. I did not say a single word to him. I simply unlocked the glass screen and tapped the application that controlled my home security servers. I found the specific audio file I had saved just days earlier. I turned the volume on the device to its maximum setting and pressed the play button. The crystal-clear digital audio filled the quiet elevator lobby. It was the recording from the hidden microphone placed inside my living room. The sound of Cameron interacting with the fake neurologist echoed sharply off the cold marble walls. We stood together in absolute silence and listened to his arrogant, confident voice flowing from the small speaker. The recording captured the exact moment Cameron offered the fraudulent doctor a massive, illegal cash bribe to falsify my cognitive evaluation. It captured my son demanding that the medical paperwork be rushed so he could immediately declare me mentally incompetent and seize my entire estate. Cameron stopped breathing completely. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw trembled as he listened to his own voice casually plotting the total destruction of his father's life. The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. He opened his mouth to formulate a new excuse to spin another desperate web of lies, but I did not give him the opportunity. I swiped my finger across the glass screen and opened a secure digital photo album. I turned the device around and held it up directly in front of his face. The bright screen displayed a series of high-resolution photographs captured by the private investigator Carter had hired. The images were incredibly clear and meticulously time-stamped. The first photograph showed Cameron sitting comfortably in the plush leather chair of the luxury European auto dealership. He looked supremely confident and entirely at ease in the wealthy environment. The second photograph captured the exact moment he reached across the polished glass desk and handed the senior finance manager my stolen property deed. The final image showed him smiling broadly as he signed the fraudulent bridge loan, using my forged signature as the primary guarantor. I watched his eyes dart frantically across the glowing screen. He absorbed every single damning detail of the photographs. He saw the undeniable visual proof of his enthusiastic and willing participation in the systematic theft of my lifelong assets. He could not blame Melanie for the stolen deed. He could not claim ignorance while staring at a picture of himself actively leveraging my home to finance a sports car. The illusion of his innocence was completely shattered into 1,000 pieces. He was not a helpless victim of a manipulative wife. He was a willing and calculating predator who had eagerly conspired to strip me of my dignity and my wealth. I lowered the phone and slid it quietly back into my coat pocket. Cameron was swaying slightly on his feet. The sheer magnitude of the evidence against him was physically crushing his spine. He knew the federal agents standing just a few yards away in his living room already possessed exact copies of these digital files. He knew that the government was currently building a massive, impenetrable concrete wall around his future. He had absolutely nothing left to offer, and no more lies left to tell. I reached into my breast pocket one final time. I pulled out a single pristine document folded neatly in thirds. It was a certified legal notice drafted and stamped by Carter just yesterday morning. The heavy parchment paper felt crisp and definitive in my hands. I unfolded the document and held it out toward him. I kept my voice perfectly even and entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him that this paper was not a threat or a negotiation. I explained that it was a permanent and irrevocable disinheritance notice. I detailed the precise legal mechanisms Carter had utilized to completely sever him from my bloodline. I told him that the document officially removed his name from every single trust account, every property deed, and every life insurance policy I possessed. I explained that the estate he had tried so desperately to steal was now entirely shielded by an impenetrable fortress of blind corporate trusts and anonymous charitable foundations. He was legally and financially eradicated from my existence. I told him that when I finally passed away, he would not receive a single dime, a single photograph, or a single memory of the life I had built. I informed him that he was now an absolute stranger to me in every conceivable way. I pushed the heavy parchment paper against his chest. His trembling hands moved automatically to grasp the document before it could fall to the floor. He stared blankly at the dense legal text and the heavy notary seals authenticating his total ruin. The finality of the paper was the crushing blow that finally broke him in half. He realized with absolute clarity that his relentless greed had actively destroyed the very fortune he was trying to capture. He had traded an entire lifetime of guaranteed family security for a fleeting illusion of unearned wealth, and he had ended up with absolutely nothing. Cameron stepped backward away from the elevator doors. His legs finally gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto a plush velvet sofa resting against the lobby wall. The document slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the marble floor. He bent forward and buried his face deeply into his knees. He did not cry or scream or beg anymore. He simply surrendered to the overwhelming silent despair of a man who had burned his own house to the ground and was now forced to sit quietly in the freezing ashes. The metallic chime of the elevator bell echoed softly in the lobby. The steel doors slid open behind me. I stepped into the empty cabin and pressed the button for the ground floor. I did not look back at the broken figure trembling on the sofa. I watched the metal doors slide shut, sealing him away into his new reality. The heavy metal doors of the penthouse elevator slid open with a soft, mechanical chime. The polished marble lobby of the luxury high-rise building was completely silent. The usual atmosphere of quiet wealth and exclusive privilege had been entirely stripped away. The uniformed concierge stood frozen behind his mahogany desk, watching the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. I walked out of the elevator cab, keeping my pace slow and deliberate. I was followed immediately by two towering federal agents. They were gripping Melanie firmly by her upper arms. Her hands were locked tightly behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs. She was no longer fighting or shouting accusations. Her expensive designer clothing was rumpled, and her perfectly styled hair hung in a chaotic mess across her tear-stained face. She was completely broken by the sheer gravity of her own catastrophic failures. She stumbled forward, dragging her feet across the expensive imported rugs. Cameron trailed a few paces behind us. His shoulders were slumped heavily forward, and his gaze was fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution. The pristine legal document I had handed him, the permanent and irrevocable disinheritance notice, was still burning a hole in his mind. He had traded his entire family legacy for the hollow illusion of high society wealth. He had eagerly conspired to strip away my dignity and lock me in a clinical psychiatric ward simply to finance a sports car and pay off his reckless debts. Now he was walking through his own lobby completely destitute and entirely alone. He possessed no assets, no future, and no remaining lies to tell. The federal agents guided Melanie through the heavy revolving glass doors and out into the cool night air. The circular driveway was brightly illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the armored government vehicles. The stark flashing colors reflected violently against the dark-tinted windows of the lobby. A third agent opened the heavy rear door of a black utility vehicle and pushed Melanie firmly into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a definitive and heavy metallic thud. That loud sound marked the absolute end of her arrogant socialite existence. She was gone, entirely swallowed by the federal justice system she had foolishly believed she could outsmart. I stood in the center of the spacious lobby, watching the federal convoy pull away from the curb and disappear down the dark city street. The flashing lights faded into the distance, leaving the driveway quiet and still. I turned around to face my son. Cameron was standing near a large decorative indoor fountain, staring blankly at the rippling water. His entire world had just been dismantled and boxed up into federal evidence containers. He had absolutely nothing left. He had no money, no wife, and no remaining shelter. Before Cameron could even process the absolute magnitude of his total ruin, the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened again. Two men stepped quietly into the building. They did not look like street-level criminals or violent thugs. They were dressed in immaculate dark charcoal suits with crisp white shirts and no ties. They looked exactly like successful venture capitalists or high-level corporate attorneys. They moved with a chilling and terrifying grace. They walked across the marble floor with the quiet confidence of apex predators who knew exactly where their prey was hiding. They were the shadow creditors from Apex Financial Solutions. The fraudulent wire transfer Melanie had attempted to send them had completely failed. The deadline for their $200,000 payment had officially expired. The two men spotted Cameron standing near the fountain. They did not rush forward or raise their voices. They simply walked over and positioned themselves perfectly on either side of him. They boxed him into the corner with calculated military precision. They effectively blocked his path to the elevators and cut off his route to the front door. Cameron looked up from the water and saw the two men standing intimately close to him. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His entire body began to tremble violently. The deep, primal terror radiating from his eyes was absolute. The taller of the two men leaned forward slightly and spoke to Cameron in a very low and polite register. I could hear the quiet menace dripping from his every word. He informed my son that the international wire transfer had been flagged and permanently blocked. He stated that the syndicate had grown incredibly impatient with the endless delays and the fabricated excuses. He told Cameron that the full balance of $200,000 was due immediately in physical currency. The man smiled warmly, but his eyes were completely dead. He placed a heavy hand firmly onto my son's shoulder. His fingers dug deeply into the expensive fabric of Cameron's jacket. He suggested that they leave the lobby and take a quiet ride together to discuss the final payment arrangements. Cameron was hyperventilating severely. His chest heaved up and down in rapid, shallow gasps. He knew exactly what a quiet ride with these men entailed. He knew that the Shadow Syndicate did not tolerate failure, and they did not accept apologies. They only accepted blood or money. Cameron looked frantically around the empty lobby, searching desperately for any possible avenue of escape. The concierge had abandoned his post entirely and retreated into a back office. The security guards were nowhere to be found. Cameron finally turned his terrified gaze toward me. I was standing less than 10 feet away, watching the confrontation unfold with complete emotional detachment. My son looked at me and began to weep. The arrogant businessman who had aggressively demanded I sign away my entire estate was completely gone. He was replaced by a frightened child, begging for his father to protect him from the dark. He reached a trembling hand out in my direction. He pleaded with me to pay the men. He begged me to transfer the funds from my secure corporate accounts to save his life. He promised me that he would change completely. He swore he would dedicate the rest of his life to repaying the debt and making amends for his terrible actions. He cried that he was my only flesh and blood, and that I simply could not stand by and let these monsters take him away. I looked at the tears streaming down his pale face. I remembered the countless times I had bailed him out of trouble when he was a boy. I remembered paying his debts and fixing his mistakes because I believed it was my paternal duty to protect him. I remembered the immense sacrifices I had made to ensure he never had to experience the harsh and unforgiving realities of the world. But those days were permanently over. He had willingly exploited that unconditional love and attempted to weaponize it against me. He had chosen to treat my life as a disposable resource. He had actively conspired to lock me in a psychiatric facility simply to clear his own path to unearned wealth. The biological connection between us had been entirely severed by his own ruthless and calculating greed. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the man sobbing before me. I stepped entirely out of the way, creating a clear, unobstructed path for the two men in sharp suits. I looked deeply into the terrified eyes of my former son. My voice was perfectly flat and carried the weight of absolute finality. "You claimed you were the man of the house," I said quietly. "Handle your debts." Cameron stared at me in total shock. The final shred of his desperate hope completely dissolved. He finally understood that there was no safety net left to catch him. He was falling freely into the dark abyss he had selfishly dug for himself. The two men gripped his arms tightly and began dragging him toward the glass doors. He did not fight back. He simply collapsed into their hold, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of his immediate future. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and walked steadily toward the exit. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The city was alive with bright lights and the distant sound of traffic. I walked down the curved driveway and climbed into the cabin of my truck. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I left the luxury building and the shattered remains of my former family entirely behind me. The long and bitter conflict was finally over. The poison had been completely excised from my life. I drove smoothly through the city streets feeling nothing but the profound and absolute peace of a man who had successfully reclaimed his own quiet existence. The federal building was a towering monolith of concrete and tinted glass, standing in the center of the financial district. It projected an aura of absolute authority and sterile efficiency. I walked through the heavy revolving doors and approached the security checkpoint. I placed my tailored coat and my polished leather briefcase onto the conveyor belt and walked confidently through the metal detector. The armed guards were polite but entirely impersonal. They handed me a visitor badge and directed me to the 14th floor. I stepped into the empty elevator and watched the digital display climb steadily higher into the structure. I did not feel any anxiety or apprehension about the meeting ahead. I felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a man walking into a room to deliver the final nail for a meticulously crafted coffin. The metal doors slid open, and a young federal clerk escorted me down a long white hallway. We entered a stark, brightly lit interrogation room. The walls were bare and painted a harsh, clinical white. The air smelled heavily of industrial cleaning supplies and stale coffee. A large stainless steel table dominated the center of the space, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. Special Agent Miller entered the room a few moments later. He was a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a thick paper file tucked securely under his right arm. He offered me a warm, patronizing smile as he sat down across the cold metal table. He spoke to me in a slow, deliberate cadence. He used the soft, gentle tone that people instinctively reserve for frightened children and fragile senior citizens. He assumed I was a confused and terrified victim. He genuinely believed I was a senile old man who had been ruthlessly manipulated and emotionally abused by a greedy daughter-in-law. He opened his thick file and slid a single sheet of paper across the steel surface. It was a color photocopy of the forged wire transfer authorization that Melanie had attempted to process. He asked me very gently if I recognized the signature at the bottom of the page. He told me to take my time and assured me that I was completely safe in this building. He promised me that Melanie and Cameron were in federal custody and could no longer hurt me. I looked down at the forged document resting on the table. The imitation of my handwriting was pathetic and terribly rushed. I did not reach out to touch the paper. I looked up and met Special Agent Miller's gaze directly. I did not offer him the confused, helpless stare he was so clearly expecting. I kept my posture completely rigid and my facial expression entirely blank. I told him that the signature was a crude forgery executed by a desperate woman who was drowning in illicit debt. My voice did not waver or crack. It was sharp, commanding, and perfectly steady. I watched the patronizing smile slowly fade from the federal agent's face. The atmosphere in the sterile interrogation room shifted immediately. The false, comforting warmth evaporated entirely, leaving behind a stark and serious professional tension. I reached down and lifted my heavy leather briefcase onto the stainless steel table. The brass locks clicked open with a sharp mechanical sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. I reached inside the briefcase and withdrew a pristine black binder. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, right on top of his forged transfer document. I told the agent that a simple signature verification would not be necessary today. I explained that I had not come to this building to play the role of a helpless victim seeking government protection. I had come to provide the federal authorities with an absolute and inescapable chronological roadmap of every single crime my son and his wife had committed over the past 6 months. I opened the black binder and began to lay out the physical evidence. I arranged a row of silver digital drives across the cold steel. I told the agent that the first drive contained high-definition security footage from my private study. I explained that the video captured Melanie physically breaking into my locked office and desperately photographing the decoy treasury ledger. I slid a thick stack of printed banking logs across the table. I detailed how these specific documents tracked every single unauthorized credit card application Melanie had filed using my personal identification numbers. I pointed to a separate manila envelope and stated that it contained certified copies of the fraudulent bridge loan Cameron had recently signed at a luxury auto dealership. I explained that my son had willingly leveraged a stolen and forged property deed to finance a vehicle he could not possibly afford. The conflict in the room was no longer a gentle interview between an investigator and an elderly victim. It was a rigorous professional briefing between two architects of justice. The agent stared at the mountain of pristine evidence, completely stunned by the sheer volume and flawless organization of the data I was presenting. I did not stop there. I pulled out a small digital audio player and placed it next to the silver drives. I told the agent that this device contained the most critical piece of the entire puzzle. I explained that Melanie and Cameron were currently sitting in a holding cell building a legal defense based entirely on my supposed mental incompetence. I knew they would instruct their expensive defense attorneys to claim that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. They would argue that I had willingly given them control of my finances in a state of advanced dementia, and that the illegal wire transfers were merely a tragic family misunderstanding. I pressed the play button on the digital device. The crystal-clear audio of Cameron attempting to bribe the fraudulent neurologist filled the sterile room. The agent listened in absolute silence as my son offered thousands of dollars in illicit cash to secure a fake medical diagnosis to forcefully commit me to a psychiatric ward. I stopped the recording and looked directly into the eyes of the federal investigator. I told him that this specific audio file effectively dismantled any possibility of a dementia defense. I explained that the recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my son and his wife were actively engaged in a premeditated criminal conspiracy to forcefully strip me of my human rights. They knew I was perfectly sane, and they were entirely willing to commit medical fraud to eliminate me from my own estate. I pushed the entire collection of evidence across the steel table. I told the agent that Melanie and Cameron had absolutely no viable defense left to present to a judge. The legal trap was completely sealed and permanently welded shut. Special Agent Miller looked down at the meticulously catalogued dossier and then slowly looked up at me. The lingering pity in his eyes was entirely gone. It was replaced by a profound and chilling professional respect. He realized that the old man sitting across from him had single-handedly engineered the total destruction of an aggressive criminal enterprise without ever raising his voice. He nodded slowly and carefully gathered the evidence into his arms. He thanked me for my unprecedented cooperation and assured me that the felony convictions were now an absolute mathematical certainty. I stood up from the metal table and closed my empty leather briefcase. I walked out of the interrogation room and navigated the long white corridors with measured steps. I rode the elevator down to the main lobby and stepped out through the heavy revolving glass doors. The bright afternoon sunlight washed over my face as I walked down the busy city street. The silent reckoning was finally complete, and my legacy was perfectly secure. The passage of exactly 1 week had restored a profound sense of tranquility to my home. The heavy, suffocating presence of deceit was completely gone. I spent my mornings tending to the small garden and my evenings reading quietly in my study. The house felt lighter, and the natural order of my existence had been firmly reestablished. I was standing in the kitchen pouring a fresh cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp and frantic, echoing aggressively through the quiet hallway. I did not rush. I placed my cup on the granite counter and walked slowly toward the foyer. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of the door. I had been expecting this final visit. I turned the brass handle and pulled the door open. The cool evening breeze swept across the porch. Cameron stood under the amber glow of the outdoor light. The transformation he had undergone in a single week was absolutely staggering. The arrogant businessman who favored imported Italian suits and expensive haircuts was completely erased. He was wearing a wrinkled gray hooded sweatshirt and faded denim jeans. His face was covered in a patchy, unkempt beard, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He was trembling violently. In his hands, he clutched two large black plastic trash bags. They were stuffed full of the only possessions he had left in the world. He had been reduced to carrying his entire life in garbage bags. He looked over his shoulder, constantly scanning the dark, quiet street. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow with the frantic panic of a hunted animal. The shadow creditors from the financial syndicate had clearly taken everything from him. They had stripped away his fake wealth and evicted him from his luxury penthouse. They had confiscated his expensive vehicles and frozen whatever meager funds he possessed to cover his illicit debts. Melanie was sitting in a federal holding facility facing decades of imprisonment. Cameron was completely alone and entirely defenseless. He was a man who had built his identity on the illusion of power, and now he was terrified of the dark. He turned his face back to me and his lower lip quivered. He begged me to let him inside. His voice was a thin, raspy whisper, completely stripped of its former arrogance. He told me that he had absolutely nowhere else to go. He admitted that the men in the dark suits were actively looking for him, and that they had threatened him with severe physical violence. He claimed he had been sleeping in a cheap motel until his final credit card was declined. He looked down at the plastic trash bags in his hands and then looked back up at me with tears streaming down his face. He asked if he could just come inside and sleep in his childhood bedroom. The mention of his childhood bedroom stirred a distant memory. I looked at the broken man standing on my porch and remembered the small boy I had once known. I remembered spending an entire weekend painting those bedroom walls a bright sky blue. I remembered building a wooden bookshelf to hold his baseball trophies and his comic books. I had spent countless nights sitting on the edge of that bed, listening to his childish fears and promising him that he would always be safe in my house. But that innocent boy had died a very long time ago. He had been replaced by a calculating stranger who saw my love as a weakness to be exploited. One of the heavy plastic trash bags slipped from his trembling grip. It hit the wooden deck and split open, spilling a pile of tangled shirts across the porch. Cameron dropped the other bag and fell heavily to his knees. He grabbed the wooden frame of the door with both hands. He looked up at me and used the word "Dad." He tried to weaponize our biological bond one final time. He sobbed and promised that he would change. He swore he would do any manual labor I asked of him. He offered to sleep on the hard floor and eat only my leftovers if I would just provide him with a safe place to hide. I stood in the doorway and observed his pathetic display without a single trace of emotion. I did not feel any sudden surge of anger or any lingering sorrow. I only felt the profound and chilling emptiness of looking at a complete stranger. I had not yelled at him once throughout this entire agonizing ordeal. I had not raised my voice when I discovered his fraud, or when he tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I was certainly not going to start yelling now. True power does not require volume. The silence stretched between us, forcing Cameron to sit alone in the miserable reality of his own making. He babbled incoherently about family and forgiveness. He begged me to remember the good times we had shared before Melanie poisoned his mind. He was still trying to shift the blame, still refusing to accept total responsibility for his own cruel choices. I took a slow breath of the crisp evening air. I looked past him at the peaceful suburban street. This neighborhood was my sanctuary. It was a place of quiet dignity that I had paid for with decades of honest labor. He had willingly brought criminals and federal agents to my doorstep simply to satisfy his monstrous greed. He had treated my legacy as a checking account he could drain at his leisure. He had forfeited his right to claim this space as his home. I looked down at him one last time. My voice was perfectly level, and carried the weight of absolute finality. It held no malice, but it offered no mercy. I told him that actions have permanent consequences. I looked deeply into his panicked eyes. I paid for your life until you decided my life was yours to spend. Cameron stared up at me with his mouth slightly open. He could not process the absolute and freezing detachment in my voice. He had expected me to be furious. Anger would mean there was still a connection between us. My cold indifference broke him completely. He realized that the father who had always bailed him out of trouble was truly gone forever. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold wooden planks of the porch. I stepped back slowly into the warm hallway. I firmly grasped the heavy wooden door and pushed it forward. He did not try to stop it. He simply let his hands fall away from the doorframe. The thick oak panel closed smoothly until the metal latch clicked securely into place. The physical barrier between our worlds was now permanent. I reached forward and turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The loud mechanical sliding sound echoed through the silent foyer with absolute finality. I walked away from the door and headed back toward the kitchen, leaving him outside in the dark. The drive back to my neighborhood was entirely peaceful. I parked my truck in the driveway and turned off the engine. The street was bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, and the tall oak trees cast long, familiar shadows across the manicured lawns. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the front steps of my house. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The interior of the house was completely dark and perfectly silent. The suffocating tension that had poisoned the air for the past 6 months was entirely gone. The heavy, oppressive feeling of being constantly watched and calculated and plotted against had vanished. The atmosphere was clean and still. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood fill my lungs. I was alone. I was truly alone in my own home for the first time since my son and his wife had launched their vicious campaign to destroy me. I walked slowly down the main hallway. I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. The pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows provided more than enough illumination to guide my path. I passed by the empty guest room where Cameron and Melanie had tried to impose their parasitic presence. I passed by the living room where they had staged their pathetic intervention with the fraudulent doctor. Those events already felt like distant memories, fading rapidly into the shadows. The house had rejected them, just as I had. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of the heavy oak door of my private study. This was the room Melanie had violated. This was the sanctuary she thought she had conquered when she picked the lock and photographed the decoy ledger. I reached deep into the pocket of my trousers. My fingers closed around a heavy object. I pulled out a solid, authentic brass key. It was not the simple silver key I had left hanging on the kitchen rack for Melanie to easily find. It was the original master key to my study. The metal was cool and heavy in my palm. It was the physical manifestation of my absolute control over my own life. I inserted the brass key into the lock and turned it. The heavy internal tumblers clicked back with a satisfying mechanical sound. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was exactly as I had left it. The moonlight washed over the dark mahogany desk and the tall bookshelves lining the walls. In the corner of the room stood the small metal safe Melanie had discovered. It was nothing more than a hollow prop designed to test her greed. I walked over to the cheap metal box and picked it up with one hand. It weighed almost nothing. I set it aside on a nearby chair, completely discarding the fake narrative it had served. I moved to the center of the room and knelt down on the thick Persian rug. The woven fabric was soft beneath my hands. I gripped the thick edge of the rug and rolled it back toward the desk, exposing the polished hardwood floor beneath. The wooden planks appeared entirely seamless to the untrained eye. But I knew exactly where to look. I ran my fingers along a specific grain in the dark wood and found the tiny hidden latch. I pressed down firmly, and a square section of the floorboards popped up with a quiet click. I lifted the wooden panel and set it aside on the rug. Beneath the floorboards lay the true heart of my financial existence. It was a massive reinforced steel floor safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation of the house. The thick steel dial caught the faint light from the window. This was the vault that Cameron and Melanie never even knew existed. They were so blinded by their own arrogant assumptions that they never bothered to look beneath the surface. I reached down and began to spin the heavy metal dial. The combination was a sequence of numbers known only to me. I turned the dial left and right, listening to the heavy steel tumblers dropping perfectly into place. The final click resonated through the quiet room. I grabbed the thick metal handle and pulled upward. The heavy steel door swung open on its silent hinges. Inside the dark cavity of the safe rested a sleek black laptop and a thick leather-bound ledger. These were not props or decoys. They were the actual instruments of my wealth. I lifted the laptop from the safe and carried it over to my mahogany desk. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, casting a cool blue light across the dark room. I typed in my complex security passwords and navigated past the encrypted firewalls. I opened the master files that contained my true financial portfolio. The numbers populated the bright screen in neat, endless rows. The accounts were massive and sprawling. There were diversified investment portfolios and secure offshore holdings and vast real estate trusts. The wealth I had accumulated over a lifetime of ruthless corporate strategy was entirely intact. It was completely untouched by the greedy hands of my son and his desperate wife. The digital alarms had never been tripped. The security protocols had never been breached. The money was perfectly safe, and it was entirely my own. Cameron had always believed that wealth was something to be loudly displayed and aggressively weaponized against others. He thought that expensive suits and leased luxury vehicles were the true markers of a successful man. He never understood the quiet and invisible power of absolute financial security. He never learned the lessons I tried to teach him about patience and discipline and the ruthless protection of personal borders. He had mistaken my quiet life for weakness and my simplicity for senility. That fundamental misunderstanding had cost him his freedom and his future. I closed the laptop screen and plunged the room back into the soft shadows of the moonlight. I stood up from the desk and walked over to the small wooden side table resting against the far wall. A crystal decanter filled with aged bourbon sat on a silver tray alongside a single heavy glass tumbler. Next to the tray was a silver picture frame. I picked up the frame and looked closely at the photograph inside. It was a picture of my late wife, Joanne. She was smiling brightly, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Her eyes were warm and full of life. Joanne had always believed in the inherent goodness of people. She had always hoped that Cameron would eventually outgrow his selfish tendencies and become a man of substance and honor. I had shared that hope for many years until the undeniable evidence of his treachery forced me to accept reality. I knew that Joanne would have wept to see what our son had become, but I also knew she would have wanted me to protect the sanctuary we had built together with our own hands. I held the silver frame in my hands and spoke to her in the quiet stillness of the room. I did not speak out loud. I projected my thoughts directly to her memory. I told her that our home was finally safe. I told her that I had protected the legacy we built together from the predators who sought to dismantle it. I acknowledged that our son had chosen a dark and terrible path, but I promised her that his poison would never touch the foundation of what we created. I placed the silver frame gently back onto the tray. I reached out and removed the heavy glass stopper from the crystal decanter. I picked up the glass tumbler and poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid. The sound of the bourbon splashing against the crystal was the only noise in the entire house. It was a rich, comforting sound that signaled the absolute end of the conflict. I lifted the glass and brought it to my lips. The bourbon was smooth and burned with a familiar pleasant heat as it traveled down my throat. I carried the heavy glass back to my desk and sat down once again in my leather chair. I leaned back against the supportive cushions and took another slow sip of the drink. I looked out the tall window at the dark silhouettes of the trees swaying gently in the night wind. The house was enveloped in a profound and impenetrable silence. There were no more lies to uncover. There were no more traps to set, or federal agents to summon. There was no more screaming or begging or pretending. The quiet was absolute and entirely pure. The predators had been systematically drawn out into the light and completely destroyed by their own desperate greed. The poison had been drawn from the well. The infection had been surgically and ruthlessly excised from my life. I rested my hand on the smooth surface of the mahogany desk and breathed in the quiet air. Order had been restored. The profound lesson embedded within this ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud displays of dominance or aggressive posturing, but in silent, unwavering preparation. Greed acts as a blinding agent that inevitably causes the arrogant to underestimate the quiet and the observant. When you build a fortress of truth and protect your boundaries with absolute discipline, you do not need to raise your voice to defeat those who seek to exploit you. Silence, when combined with meticulous foresight, becomes an impenetrable shield that ultimately forces the wicked to dismantle their own lives. If you found this story compelling, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives.